In this video, I want to talk about the Greek period, from Alexander the Great to Antiochus Epiphanes, from 332 BC, when Alexander the Great came through, to 167 BC, when a Jewish revolt rose up against Antiochus Epiphanes and Greek rule, and eventually led to Jewish independence. You'll remember that there's a 200-year period from roughly 400 BC to 200 BC where we have very little information. So when we talk about the Greek period and we make a break with Alexander the Great, there's a lot more continuity than change that is going on. And the decisive period is the end of the Greek period, at least from a Judean perspective, in 167 BC. If we're talking about solid details about life in Judea, we don't have a lot to go on during this period of Greek rule, at least the first 100 years between Alexander the Great and Antiochus Epiphanes' father, Antiochus III, Antiochus the Great. But we can talk about the political big picture. So let's start with Judea, or the province of Yehud, Persian province of Yehud. And if you look along the coast, there's roads going north and south. And when armies came from the north into Egypt, and from Egypt going north into Mesopotamia, for instance, and skirting the desert, they would go along the coast. And Judea is in the hill country, relatively isolated. What happens when Alexander the Great dies? He has this massive empire and he falls sick and dies in 323 BC in modern-day Iran, in Persia. One of his generals, Perdiccas, is appointed as regent, in the idea that he's going to appoint other generals and they're going to jointly rule this whole empire. It's a great idea, but he dies in 2 years in 321 BC. And there's a series of wars between generals who have been appointed to rule different areas. They're battling for control. And after a series of wars, say 314 BC, we end up with these three main players: the Seleucids, who have Babylon or Persia in blue, and the Ptolemies in green in Egypt, and Antigonus in Asia Minor and going through Syria and down into Palestine. You read in Nikolsburg that in a period of 21 years, between 323 and 302, as the Diadochoi are fighting each other, Alexander's successors, that's the Greek word for successors. During this 21-year period, Syria and Palestine changed hands 7 times. So there's a lot of fighting back and forth during this initial period. Antigonus is killed in battle in 301 BC at the age of 80-something. And at that point, we end up with 2 main players: the Seleucids, who have taken over Antigonus's realm in modern-day Turkey, and the Ptolemies. And you can see that the Ptolemies now have control over Palestine. So the Seleucids were promised Palestine and Syria, but they never actually got their hands on it, and the Ptolemies retained control. So the Ptolemies have Palestine, and they have it for over 100 years, between 302 and 198 BC. And the Seleucids during this time want it. Here's a quote from Josephus about Ptolemy I Soter when he conquered Jerusalem. This would be around 302 BC. Josephus says, "This king seized Jerusalem by resorting to cunning and deceit, for he entered the city on the Sabbath as if to sacrifice, and as the Jews did not oppose him, he became master of the city without difficulty and ruled it harshly." You need to notice here, why is it that the Jews did not oppose him? Because they were observing the Sabbath laws. You don't work on the Sabbath, you don't fight on the Sabbath. Ptolemy takes advantage of it and captures the city. Josephus thinks this is a bad thing, but it also lets us know that Gentiles, non-Jews, are aware of Jewish observance of the Sabbath. Big picture highlights of the 3rd century BC under Ptolemaic control when we're talking about Judea. Ptolemy apparently takes some Jews and settles them in Egypt, and others moved of their own accord. So there's a large Jewish population in Egypt that's settling there during this time. And in the 1st century AD, you have a massive Jewish population in the city of Alexandria in Egypt. The Ptolemies apparently allowed the Jews religious autonomy. They were able to practice their own way of life, and they didn't have to say worship the Ptolemy as God or anything like that. Ptolemies were known for their well-organized system of government. We have some key evidence for this. There's a guy by the name of Zenon who spent the year 259 BC traveling through Palestine and southern Syria, trying to set up trade arrangements for his boss in Egypt, and he wrote a bunch of letters. And he took copies of letters that he received, and that gives us a great image of political life in Palestine, in Judea during this period. Josephus has an account, and it's sort of like a novel, but there may be some historical details behind it, of a family of tax farmers who lived on the other side of the Jordan, and they were known as the Tobiads. And the main character in this story is one of the main characters, marries the sister of the Jewish high priest in Jerusalem, Onias II. If you've done some reading in Nehemiah, maybe you want to pick up Nehemiah and read it. Nehemiah's main opponent is Tobiah the Ammonite. And here we see a Tobiad family that's influential in leaders of the Jews in Judea. So a well-organized government. Egypt got its main income from Palestine through taxes. And so there's an organized system of taxation, and it seems to have continued past the Ptolemaic period. Seleucids take over, well, we'll continue accepting taxes from you. During this period, according to tradition, the library at Alexandria, the Ptolemy who was in charge at this time in the 3rd century BC, wanted a copy of the Jewish law in Greek. How much of a historical kernel is there behind that story? We are working with a 3rd century date, 3rd century BC date for the translation of the Septuagint into Greek, and it was used by Jews in Egypt during this time, Greek-speaking Jews. And eventually the rest of our Old Testament was translated into Greek as well, but the Torah goes back to the 3rd century. I mentioned these in an earlier video. The traditional way of life continued. Greek rulers followed well-established precedent, let the Jews observe their own way of life. And by this period, the high priest is the religious and the political leader at the same time. At least by the end of this period, so a century of Ptolemaic control, Seleucids want control, and Judea is in the middle. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, but you can see how there can be regional conflict involving the Jewish elite, especially if Ptolemaic power begins to break down and leaders in Judea want to know which way the wind is blowing. Who should we be supporting? Who's going to come out on top? And that can lead to intrigue, and that's going to have implications that's going to continue later on when we talk about the Maccabean revolt. Take a look at this slide. On the left are Ptolemies, and it's you can always know who's going to be in control in Egypt. It's Ptolemy, and later on you have some Cleopatras as well, and they're all taking the same name. Just like in the Bible, the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt is always known as Pharaoh. During this period, the king of Egypt is always known as Ptolemy. On the right, the Seleucids are a little bit more creative. You've got Seleucus, Antiochus, Antiochus, Seleucus, Seleucus, Antiochus, Seleucus, Antiochus, Antiochus, Demetrius. And these guys, some of them are just pretending to be the son of somebody else. And towards the tail end, you have overlapping reigns because they're fighting amongst each other in the Seleucid area. A little more creative. If you're a Seleucid, you can choose between 3 names if you like. It sort of makes you dizzy looking at it. If we had several more hours, we could sort it all out, but we're just going to move on. What was the nature of this regional conflict, and how did it affect Judea? I've already mentioned that there was a lot of changing of hands of Judea, of Palestine, in the early period, And then you've got a century of Ptolemaic rule. And you could say that there was ongoing battle back and forth, even though the Ptolemies retained control, because there were 3 Syrian wars during this period. The thing is, the 3 Syrian wars don't seem to have involved actual Seleucid invasion through Kole, Syria. When you get to Antiochus III, Antiochus the Great, at the beginning of his reign, he attempts a conquest of this area that had been promised to his family, and he fails the first time between 219 and 217 BC, but he invades into Palestine. And then between 201 and 198, he succeeds finally in taking control of this area of Syria and Palestine. So 200 BC, there's a battle at Panion, which in New Testament times is known as Caesarea Philippi. Jesus visits Caesarea Philippi near the headwaters of the Jordan River. 198 BC, he's farther south. He's almost at Egypt in Gaza, an ancient Philistine city, which is now located in the Gaza Strip. So that's Antiochus the Great. 190 BC, Seleucus is defeated decisively by the Romans, and one of his sons is taken hostage to Rome. So we shouldn't forget about the Romans. But there are some invasions in the 4th and 5th Syrian wars. What's the impact on Judea? You could say none whatsoever. And here's Seth Schwartz. Despite the violence of part of the period in the world around it, Yehud, or Judea, experienced these centuries as unprecedentedly peaceful ones. Macedonian conquerors, Persian resistors, Diadochic generals, and their descendants who went to war over Palestine 5 times in under a century, restricted their activities to the coastal plain, leaving Yehud, or Judea, entirely in peace. And I'd say I'm on board with that for the most of the first 100 years, but towards the end, when Antiochus III comes into play, it does seem like there's more interaction with Judea. So these are modern maps that are going to come on the slide here, but it's building off bits and pieces of evidence that we have that the battles extended inland into the hill country, into even Judea. So some significant conflict at the end. And again, which way is the wind blowing? And if you choose the wrong guy, you might find yourself out or executed if you're a Jewish leader in Jerusalem during this period. So you've got over a century of Greek rule, and Greek rule, Alexander the Great's conquest, is often associated with Hellenism. In your reading from Cohen talks about 2 different ways of defining Hellenism, and he concludes that the term is unhelpful. He's not going to use it. So on the one hand, you've got Hellenism as worship of Greek gods, the practice of Greek ways. It's the opposite of Judaism, the worship of the God of Israel, and the practice of Jewish ways. But Hellenism is also used for the amalgamation of cultures. Greeks come and take over Persia, and they're influenced by Persian culture, and the combination of both is Hellenism. And when you combine Judaism and Greek culture, you get Hellenism as well. And that's not the opposite of Judaism, it's the combination of Greek and a Jewish way of thought. Seth Schwartz, in a 2001 book, overlaps with Cohen's idea. He talks about 2 kinds of Hellenization, and it's not a thing now, ism, it's a practice, Hellenization. And it seems to me that Seth carries it forward a little bit, Seth Schwartz, I should say. And I like the distinction that he's making here. This is also on your handout. Let me read what's on the slide. Let us begin by separating Hellenization in the sense of acting Greek while maintaining one's own cultural identity from Hellenization in the sense of becoming Greek, and so necessarily abandoning one's previous cultural identity. And then he talks about how in the Hellenistic period, you couldn't separate the 2. In the Roman period, it was possible to act Greek while maintaining your own identity, or much more possible to do that. Hellenization in the first sense might culminate in Hellenization in the second sense, but need not do so. In fact, it may even function to preserve a native non-Greek culture. And Hellenization in the second sense, becoming Greek, need not presuppose prior cultural Hellenization in the first sense. So changing your identity, abandoning your Jewishness and becoming Greek need not involve prior acting Greek. And acting Greek need not lead to becoming Greek. Two ancient processes. So it's not now modern definitions as much as a modern analysis pointing out two different kinds of practice in the ancient world. Modern analogy might be religious fundamentalism. So if you talk to a fundamentalist Muslim, they will likely say, I'm doing just what Muhammad told me to do. If you talk to a historian of Islam, they might say, actually, fundamentalist Islam is a new phenomenon that showed up in, say, the late 19th, early 20th century. It was a result of Western ways of thinking, Western practices, and it was a reaction to Western thinking. And in reaction to Western thought, it internalized and embodied Western thought. Christian fundamentalism would be similar. So Christian fundamentalism as a reaction to late 19th, early 20th century modern thought, and especially modern liberal theology in the early 20th century, a response to modernity that from our vantage point, we can look back and say, hey, early 20th century Christian fundamentalist, you are thinking about truth and about the world in a very modern sort of way, and you're using modernity in your response to modernity. And we might be able to say from our vantage point that there's some problems with that way of thinking. What I'm trying to illustrate is that it's possible to, in the ancient world, to act Greek and to borrow from Greek ways of thinking in order to defend your own way of life. And we see that happening on the ground in the ancient world. So resistance to foreign forces incorporates what it resists. Here's Seth Schwartz again. The basic problem that confronted all the Jews of antiquity was how to preserve Jewish identity while living within Hellenistic culture. So this is important in itself, but it's also important to respond to some misconceptions. There's often a false idea that Hellenistic Judaism is a distortion of pure Palestinian Judaism, and a related false idea that Greek and Hebrew are two radically different ways of thinking. And you see this often in scholarship, and it's a problematic distinction. And Cohen points out that all Judaism was Hellenized Judaism. It was influenced by the surrounding Greek culture, and it was part of that culture. There's also a problematic stereotype that I've mentioned already, the idea that Alexander and his successors intentionally spread Hellenism, Greek culture. They wanted to make people Greek. The reality is that there was no grand Hellenizing policy. On the one hand, Greek cultural influence is already present in the Persian period. And as the Greek period progresses, we see Greek cities coming around Judea, growing up around Judea. But in the first century, at least, and here I'm borrowing from Schwartz again, there's very little evidence of Greek ways of acting and speaking, Schwartz says, on the ground in Judea. And more importantly, we don't see generally a top-down policy where Greeks want to make their subjects Greek. What happens instead, I would suggest, is local elites finding that to get ahead, they need to learn Greek, and practicing certain Greek cultural elements enables them to get ahead. So the desire to advance politically exerts pressure on local people to adopt Greek ways of acting and speaking. The other sort of foreign influence that I want to just highlight here is Rome is on the horizon in the Greek period. You're going to read parts of First Maccabees in a little bit. First Maccabees chapter 12, mentions a letter sent to the Romans by the Jewish high priest Onias I, already in 300 BC. That's right at the beginning of the Greek period.